Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As sponsors of this event, I'd like to join the economists and the panel to welcome you to this conference. I'm sure it's going to be, and it has been, thoughtful and thought-provoking, and some interesting thoughts are emerging from the discussions we've had so far. Well, as you can see from the program, this panel session will discuss three particular things. First of all, the European economy itself, which is somewhat on demand, the regulatory landscape, which is changing quite rapidly, and I'll take you through a few developments in this regard. And equally important, I think, from a business perspective, is the implications on the financial services industry of this literally tsunami of regulations. I had 7 minutes, being cut to 5, so I'll expedite a bit this presentation, but I thought that I'd cover this in two core areas. Well, in the first part, just a quick historic snapshot of the European economic performance over the last 5 to 6 years. I'd just like to dwell a bit as well on the root causes which led to the situation we are in today. But I'd like to focus my minutes on the new regulatory landscape, and particularly from a business point of view, the implications of new regulations on the industry, particularly because of the famous law, or infamous law of unintended consequences. Well, if pictures say 1,000 words, I think this slide does justice, and it practically encapsulates the performance of the European economy over these last 5 to 6 years. Clearly, the Eurozone and Europe itself has been gripped somewhat by debt quakes. We've seen that in a number of countries and the ramifications of that. We can have a look at Greece, we can have a look at Iceland and see the implications and ramifications, not only insofar as the financial institutions are concerned, but also the ramifications at the social level, because it brings about social unrest, it induces inflation, and these are the ramifications of the instability we've had in this respect. Clearly, this posed economic growth challenges, driven predominantly by the significant unemployment, particularly in the youth segment of the market, most notably mentioned yesterday in Italy and even in Spain. And this creates, obviously, weakens the element of entrepreneurship in any economy when this takes place. Well, we're seeing a paradigm shift now, a shift from an industry which went through a process of deregulation to an industry which is going to re-regulation. And we're seeing too much regulation, in my view, in too short time, which is having an impact on the practitioners and the operators, which are at the center of this. I mean, operators are trying to manage the short-term market dynamics of the implications of these regulations, possibly at the expense of missing out on the longer trends, which will shape the competitive landscape of Europe going forward. So what are the root causes? Well, I could dwell for an hour on the root causes that led to where we are today, but clearly self-regulation has somewhat failed the system. It was very much advocated by politicians and by regulators and embraced by the industry. Nonetheless, we are where we are today because self-regulation has somewhat failed. This has led to losses in the marketplace, losses which had to be suffered by taxpayers. Taxpayers which were negatively impacted even by the capital markets themselves, so it was a double whammy for some taxpayers as well. Led to loss of public faith, not only in the markets, albeit we are seeing a reversal of this with money flowing gradually back into the markets, but also perhaps loss of faith in the regulatory authorities themselves. And clearly, what has been initiated predominantly by politicians is a significant regulatory reform. And if we look just a snapshot of the regulations that are changing in the market, I mean, when you talk with operators and practitioners, they are trying to handle the implications and ramifications of regulation. They are channeling, actually, information technology to address the significant reporting requirements that are emerging out of this regulation, rather than using this information technology capacity to direct it to generate new business in the marketplace. And it's not just the industry, but also the regulators. National regulators are literally struggling to keep up with all this raft of regulations. And sincerely, I do empathize with all the regulators. And just to stress this point home, this is a directive, the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, a much coveted directive, a famous or infamous directive, and this was supposed to be transposed in July 2013. Well, look at the statistics today. Less than half of the European member states have transposed this directive, which clearly shows that even regulators are struggling to keep with this raft of regulation which is coming to the market in such a short span of time. Well, there is definitely a convergent vision. So what's the state of play today? There is a convergent vision, for sure, that we want financial stability, we want to manage systemic risk. But the pace of regulatory reforms is different in different countries. And possibly this is creating an unintended consequence, that of regulatory arbitrage, because we have legislation in some countries, but we don't have that same legislation in other countries. And I think this is literally bad for the industry. As I said, possibly too much regulation too soon in such a short span of time. Well, I just want to dwell on 3 points. I know my time is quickly running up, but 3 points. Will these new regulations make Europe more competitive? Because we have to give that due consideration. We're not in isolation. Europe is competing with the US and with Asia. Business is being driven. Yesterday, Lord Mendelsohn highlighted that 90% of the demand will be from the Asian side. And financial services is a mobile business. So my worry is that this could lead to the drain of intellectual capability, because businesses could move from Europe into other regions. What about the crowding out effect? We've seen even here in Malta that some businesses, financial services operators, have decided to go out of a particular service offering. And this is particular crowding out detrimental to small island states like Malta, to small jurisdictions, to developing jurisdictions which are still growing, which are still building, developing their infrastructure. And lastly, innovation. Innovation sometimes starts, many a time, starts from small operators, small panels of operators. You look at the operators in Malta predominantly, and I can say that by looking at the member base at Finance Malta, 90% of our member base is made of SMEs, and they're struggling to cope with all this regulation. So will it crowd entrepreneurs? Will it stifle innovation? My view is that it will. And unfortunately, financial services innovation is sometimes becoming even a dead word. Well, the regulators have a key challenge for sure. They want to ensure the stability of the financial system. They want to protect investors. They want to limit as much as possible the way they react to public opinion, because sometimes some regulations are driven by reactions to public opinion. But ultimately, I think the overriding principle is to create an important framework for growth. And clearly, I think from a utopian, possibly perspective, is to get into the market the global principles which will be accepted by regulators in the same way. So we will not only avoid regulatory arbitrage in Europe, but more so avoid regulatory arbitrage between different financial centers in the world. That's my take. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that.